One more question for you. So you just framed up something I think is really interesting and totally relevant. It's about making sure you're asking the right question, right? Because if you had asked the question, which had incidents, it would have yielded something very different than how do we keep the public safer?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one because that's where I think a lot of action bias or something can come in, just being really deliberate about asking the right kind of question.
Right. Yep. And it's almost an iterative loop too, because what we're trying to do here is use real data to support the questions. There's so much, well, in every aspect of a business or a business process, but even in safety, there's so much hunches. And this is, I've been doing this for 20 years. This is what I guess. A typical thing is coming on or off vacation. Does that help or hurt, the risk of that person? And we'll bring data to that question. So we call it the Mythbuster exercise. What we do is we will start with the workshop and get everybody in the room and say, let's fill the whiteboard with what you think are driving some of these incidents and accidents. And we'll take note of those. And after several months, after we've collected all the data and build these models, we'll say, well, okay, look, you're number 2, you didn't get number 1. This is number 1. Yours numbers 2, 4, and 6 didn't even make the list. And here's several that did make the list that you didn't even consider.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a lot of incidents for us to go and look at what the data correlations are. And I jokingly tell them, y'all need to go and have some incidents so we can have some data to work with. So that's a good problem to have, is not have a lot of incidents. However, we've noticed in a lot of industries that there's this plateau, and you kind of see this in this line here where the traditional programs about safety programs or training awareness or zero incident type programs or increased observations are tending to sort of lose their steam. And so in a particular client, they approached us and said, hey, we've got all this data, what can we do with it? And so they've discovered that predictive analytics sort of gets them into the next, beyond that plateau. And so we're hoping to help all these industries lower these safety trends.
Let me preface this, Rob, with my background is not in safety, but it's in reliability. And to my benefit or detriment, I've been playing in the safety space. And the slide number 2 you had indicating that the U.S. Safety is getting better. I was wondering how your response would be to those in the progressive safety movement that are the anti-zero harm folks that would say that the numbers don't represent the realities because underreporting due to those types of programs would give you the impression you were safer, but you typically aren't. So I'm kind of curious because I see both sides of the argument, and I was just wondering, when we look at the numbers like this, and the reality is, are we safer because of these numbers?
Yeah. So there's always a little bit of that cultural things. Sometimes a first aid event should have been classified as a medical treatment, and that crosses a threshold of being reporting. Like if you cut your finger and just went and got a Band-Aid, when reality you should have, maybe it should have been sent to the hospital. There's definitely some of those kinds of things. Unfortunately, we're just dealing with the data that people are reporting. And so I think I've seen in some companies changes. I'm thinking of one manufacturer where they actually changed the rigor with which they called it reportable versus non-reportables, and actually saw an improvement in both metrics because people felt like there wasn't any ramification of reporting an injury. But there's definitely historically been some sort of misclassification, if you will, of events. But I think that boils down to that's obviously translates to a data issue for us, because if it's misclassified, then we're sort of predicting something that's misclassified. But I've seen companies where they're sort of relaxing the culture to say, look, it's really just about being safe. It doesn't matter if it's it does matter if it's reportable or non-reportable, but let's just be honest about what the incidents are and the data it's generating. First of all, and we call this sort of the 4 Ps of safety. if you know anything about marketing, they call it price, promotion, place, and something else. We sort of co-opted that phrase here, that metaphor with the 4 Ps. So we want to look at people, places, processes, and then add predictive analytics. So really, there's not one product, price, place, promotion. That's it. Thanks, Jessica. So we can actually, there's not one particular use case of collecting this data. It can actually be pointed in different directions. At the lowest level, we want to target employees, and I use target in a good sense in that we're trying to help them become safer. If you're a retailer, it might be customers in your store. The railroad case is about the public, or it might be you might have a fleet of cars out there. We're doing a project now with a gas utility, and they've got people out in the trucks, servicing gas equipment, reading meters and stuff. Well, they don't read meters anymore because they're all smart meters, but they've got people out in trucks, and they might be involved in an accident. So sometimes we want to focus on the public. Managers, we want to coach them to become better. All the outcomes are we just want to generally reduce incidents and accidents and injuries. We want to care for our employees, protect the public, and then coach the managers. Places, this would be things like facilities. It could be a manufacturing plant, an oil rig in the North Sea, a distribution center, and those associated environments. I mentioned the fleet example. Sometimes we do fleet analytics. It could actually be equipment. It might be this piece of machinery in the plant that might be old or might need maintenance, that it's causing some incidents and injuries. The idea there is it also focuses on human aspects like incidents and accidents, but also lost time incidents where you have to shut down a line in a plant because there was an accident. So it actually integrates with productivity metrics. And then we might want to discover where to invest in equipment to improve the safety. And then processes. I know if you're in oil and gas, I know this talks about how you'll replace something on an oil rig and stuff like that. But in this sense, I'm talking more about things like policies or training programs, or many regulated industries have rules. Like in the railroads, you have to get certified by the government, and there's certain rules violations. If you violate that rules, you might get a demerit. So we're looking at those kinds of things to first of all measure safety program effectiveness, design some impactful training, strengthen our policies, and overall just get good employee relations. And
yep.
I'll
it would seem pretty consistent on your physical barriers. If we go back to that train crossing, road grade, number of tracks, curve in the road, you're not going to change that in the location. But on the train, you may, or the driver, you may have 10 different drivers, and one of them decides they want to text while operating, as an example, and display a less than desired behavior. How do you take that into account, the human variability?
Well, there's two aspects of that. Number one, there's controllable factors and uncontrollable factors. So in the grade crossing thing, all the railroad can do is maybe make that better, redo the surface so it's not it's a smoother angle of approach. Maybe they can put a more restrictive warning device. But you're right, we can't, modify human behavior, and that sort of goes into the error. All we can do is say, all other things being equal, this is what we predict these causal factors will be, or what these predictions will be. Some of them are controllable, some of them are not. But you're right, we can never really control the person that's texting on the road, those kinds of things. But to the extent that we can control some of the factors, there's value in doing that as well. So in statistical terms, all that stuff sort of falls into the error component of the equation. It's just stuff that happens that we can't model or do anything about. So where do I go from here? Well, first of all, take stock of the data you already have. You might be able to extract a simple table from your SMS. Is there a simple way to add predictive analytics with that high level data in the vein that I showed you before? For example, can you make a dashboard forward looking like the last slide I just showed you? Undertake a safety data readiness assessment. As I mentioned, when we get called in, we always want to sort of look at things and say, do you even have the raw material to work with this stuff? So if you have a data scientist or an access to a data scientist or a data engineer, that's a good place to start. The caveat I'll say though is they need to have a little bit of safety domain experience. This is sort of akin to saying, I need a doctor. Well, do you need a general practitioner? Do you need an oncologist? Do you need a podiatrist, a dentist? They're all doctors. just as an anecdote, I was at a safety conference a couple of years ago, and one of a large retailer, online retailer, who was consistently in the news for being really unsafe, and even Bernie Sanders was going after them. I talked to the head of safety there, and she was talking about how we were talking about how we could use safety analytics, and she said, well, we have like 300 data scientists. I'm sure they could solve this. And, and I said, they still haven't solved it. You know, it's one thing to bring a data scientist in, but there's certain gotchas and learnings about safety specific data science that they really need to learn. So you assess your data. It determines whether the feasibility of the applications will show you given the data you have. And then there's almost always going to be a gap analysis. Doesn't mean you can't do it now or can't do it eventually. But even with some of our clients that we're working with now, we put them on a plan to say, this is what we're going to do in this phase. Then you're bringing in telematics data later. Then you're bringing in this data, and then you'll have longer history. So we'll identify those gaps. There's always some sort of gap, but it doesn't mean that you can't get started. And I would say, don't be discouraged. Nearly everyone is in the same state you are. There's very few companies that are this mature in terms of their data collection strategy.